Hello everyone, my name is Praveen and I welcome you all to the new lecture on the Docker for Beginner series. Today we're going to talk about Dockerfile. So if you're jumping directly onto this lecture, I'll highly encourage you to go through the previous lectures which has been created. So I explained in detail how to create the images, what are the concept behind the containers, what is the terminologies, how to install Docker and all those things. So today we're going to start with seeing what exactly is a Docker file. And now it's a practical time, right? So we've been going through a lot of theories in the previous lectures. Now it's practical time. Docker file is the one which is having a set of commands and instructions used to build the Docker images, right? So uh, without wasting much time, let's see what exactly is a Docker file, right? So Docker file is a plain text file. You can write it in any of the text editors, right? It's basically a set of commands or instructions, I would say. Docker is a bit opinionated about what is a name to be given to a Docker file. So it always has to be like a capital D and then Docker file. Rest of the things should be in a small case. If you want, you can give a different name basically, but I think the convention is basically to give a name like this. It's a plain text file. And by convention, it's basically put it as the root of your project directory from where you want to build it, right? So that's the convention. If you want, you can put it in different directories as well. And as a as in when we progress through our lecture, we're going to see how we can do that. So having said that, it is just a plain text file. What are the commands that you can add into that particular plain text file, right? So on your right hand side onto the screen that you're seeing is some of the most widely used commands of the Docker file. There are few which is I haven't added, which is like a very not widely used, like maintainer, and maintainer is basically a deprecated command, but these are the one which is basically very widely used. So Docker file always starts with the uh, from command. From command is basically used for showing the basically the base image for your image that you're building, right? So it is usually the uh, command for the base OS or something like this. So let's say the example would be like from Ubuntu, right? So Ubuntu is my OS that I wanted to install into my image. So that will become my from command. So it not necessarily has to be an OS, because some of the commands are has been built on top of the OS. So if I put, let's say, Alpine JDK or Open JDK, right, which is internally coming with some of its own Linux instances, right? So Alpine, which is your base, very very base of Linux container. So if I have that kind of an image, I don't need to specify the base OS first, because once I put that image, basically it's going to install the base OS plus the JDK on top of it. So something like this. Next command would be, let's say, copy. Copy, as the name suggests, basically you're copying the contents from one directory to another directory, right? So this is a directory which is specific to your image root directory, and this is the one from where you are building it. So I'm copying, let's say, from ctemp sample.txt file to, let's say, a user temp, which is user temp is a Linux based file system which on which I'm building my image, right? So it is I'm copying to this particular directory, let's say. By convention, your commands always has to be in a capital case. See, if all the commands are in a capital case, and the arguments or the variables after that has to be in a small case or something like this. A run command, as the name suggests, again you are running certain commands. Basically, a run. So there is a two commands basically here, right? So there is a run command here, and there is a one after that is a command, right? So basically both are similar, but there is subtle difference between these two. Run command is basically used whenever you want to run something at the build stage, whenever you are building your image, right? So this is the build stage, I would say, command, right? So if I want to install, let's say, curl, while I'm building my image, I'm installing curl. Let's say this is install kind of a command, right? So there I'm using run. But when I'm running my container or where I'm running my image, at that point of time, if I want to run certain command, let's say like I want to echo something, or let's say I want to run a java minus jar command, right? I want running java class into it. So that is at the runtime. So there I'm using a command. I'm not using a run at that point of time. So there is a subtle difference between these two things. Please keep that in mind. Next one would be an entry point. So as the name suggests, this would be an entry point for your container. So this would be the last thing that you're going to run when you are starting your container, right? So again, there is a subtle difference between command and entry point. If you put an entry point, you're going to override whatever you have specified into the command, right? So let's say one of the example of entry point is, let's say, java minus jar. Now I'm giving it in an array, like it's like a JSON array, right? So uh, command will come first and its arguments will come last. So java minus jar has been broken down into, let's say, three different arguments into it, or three different parameters, right? So similarly, you need to provide the entry point command. As and when we progress further, I'll show you this example as well. Expose is nothing but for exposing the port. If you are running certain uh, web-based applications, right, you want to expose certain ports on top of it. So there you are doing this expose commands. You are opening certain ports onto your container. Now another thing is, when you open a port, it is basically opening on that container itself, but not onto the machine. So you need to do some certain kind of a port mapping to, to map the ports on the machine to the port on the container. It's bit difficult to explain as of now, but I'll take an example of running an Nginx container, and I'll show you how we're going to expose those commands, those ports, right? Environment is basically nothing but for setting up an environment variables for your container. So let's say I'm setting an environment variable called as name. I'm giving value as Praveen. So it's nothing but just a key value pair, right? Pretty self-explanatory. Next command is work dir. So it's nothing but setting a current context from where you are running your commands, right? So it's basically like you are seeding onto that particular directory, and from that directory you are running your commands. So it's nothing but setting up your present or current working directory basically, right? So that is your work dir. Next command is user. So user command is basically if you want to run your process, your image process, container process with certain user, then you basically specify that user name here after the user. So that process will be owned by that user, right? Volume, nothing but when you are mapping certain file systems to your container, there you are specifying a volume. So that would be come into the further lectures. I'll not go in detail in volume as of now, but that's going to come in further lectures in this Docker series. So from the commands perspective, these are the only commands I would say. It's pretty simple. But when you're writing a Docker file, you not only need to know the Docker and the commands, but you also need to know the images that you are building. Right? You need to know that technology as well. So it's a combination of the technology or the things that you are deploying or you are containerizing and the Docker. So it's a combination of both. So let's start with very simple command, a very simple, let's say, Docker file. What we're going to do is we create a new Docker file, and then we're going to install certain packages onto it. We'll just containerize those things, right? So let me go to my Docker itself, and we'll do it there, right? So my present working directory, let's say I'm at the c:temp. What I will do is, in my c:temp, I already have one Docker file. So let me just uh, rename it, and we'll create a new Docker file here. Okay. So let's see, I create a new Docker file here, right? Now, as I told you already, the first command for you, I'll just zoom it. The first command for you is always from. and it has to be in caps, right? So I say from, and let's say I'll put a very base image of in Linux, which is Alpine, right? And I'm not specifying version, so it will take a latest by default. Now next thing, let's say okay, let's say I want to install certain things, right? So I'll first update my APK. Then let's say I'm adding Vim. I add, let's say um, let's say curl. Okay, and let's see how does this works. Okay, so we created our Docker file, and I'm going to build it, right? So the command for that is docker build, and you give the location of your Docker file. So my Docker file is currently at the C: temp only, so I'll build it from here. So if you see here, it is getting the Alpine. So since all of those things are into my cache already, so it directly take it from the cache using cache. For Vim also it is using cache, but for curl it is not in cache. Now it is basically, I think, pulling it up. So see, it is pulling it up now, and it's going to execute it. So let's see. So it has successfully built our image, right? Now the problem is, see, if I do Docker images, I haven't given any name for my image, so that's why the name is, let's say, see, coming it as none, which is not very user friendly, right? We need to have a name to run our images, otherwise you always rely on an image ID when we are running the images, right? So let's see how to give a name for your images, right? Keep an eye on the size. Also the size is like, let's say, 35.7 MB. So what I'll do now is, I'll basically execute the same thing, but this time I'll give an image. So name for that image. So the way to give it is, is a thing called as tagging. Okay, so docker build -t, which is tagging, and need to give a name. Let's say my first image. Okay, this is the name of my image. Name of the image always has to be in a lower case. There is no camel casing involved, no capital casing. Okay. Okay, so the next thing is you need to give a version for an image, right? So I'll give, let's say, 1.0, and then dot is basically specifying where exactly your Docker file residing. Then I press enter. Now everything is in my cache as of now, so this should be pretty fast. The build should be pretty fast. See, it is faster. And now if we do, let's say, Docker images, this time we should see our image. See, my first image, the size is same, 35.7, right? Good. There are certain things that you're seeing here is, let's say, these things, right? None, right? So what are those? Those are basically from a Docker terminology is called as dangling images, which is certain intermediate things that you created but never got a given name for those and all those things, right? So this is not very user friendly. So if you want, basically you can find it out, since we don't have a lot many images here, but if you have like hundreds of images, it will be difficult to find out what all those dangling images are. So all those images which is having a none as a name, repository name, right? So those are called as a dangling images in Docker terminology, and there is a way by which you can get it as well. So if you want to see how you can see, like if you have like hundreds of images into repository, how to find out how many dangling images you are having. So Docker does give you a simple little command to find those out, right? So the command for that is, let's say, Docker images, and you need to give a flag, let's say dangling equal to true, and then it should give you all the dangling images present into your repository, and then you just directly destroy it or remove it from your system, right? So that's one thing. Moving on to our tutorial, we did basically install certain packages, right? Now let's see. What we did is we install one packages per line, and the size was around 35 MB, right? So what Docker does is it gives you an option to run all these commands or specify all these commands in a single line. So I don't need to specify this run multiple times. I can do this thing as well, right? And now let's see. Okay, let's see docker build dot. Oh, I should have given a name. Let me try it one more time. Now if you see the difference here, right, it is basically trying to run it again, although everything is present into your cache, right? uh, why is that? Because we have done certain modifications into a docker file, right? So it's tried to make sure that after fetching it out, it will try to compare it with the local digest, something that we saw into the last lecture. So let it get installed, and then we'll see where we are. I think Vim is installed. I think curl is going on as of now. Let's see. Let it give a couple of minutes for it to finish. Okay, successfully built the image. So I'll do one more thing. So what I'll do is I'll tag it. Because always better to tag it, right? My first image 1.0 dot. So let us run it again. It should everything be present into the cache as of now, and it should be very quick this time. Okay, it is quick. Docker images. Okay, see, it's been created. Exactly the similar size. If you see, not much difference between these two, right? Okay, so this is how you can specify the commands, run commands into single line as well. So that's another way by which you can do it. Now let me see what's the next thing we should try to find it out in Dockerfile. Let's try to get an example of executing or installing a Nginx and containerizing it, right? So let's try to do that. So what I will do is I will create a Docker file. So this file that we created, I'll delete it for now. We don't need it. And I did created a Docker file for Nginx just a while ago, and we'll see what does it look like, right? So I'll say Docker file. Now if you see here, what I'm doing is again like the last time, I'm getting the Ubuntu as my best image. Last time we taken Alpine, this time I'm taking Ubuntu just to give a different flavor for it. Then what I'm doing is I'm running the apt-get command. So when I say last time, you need to know Docker as well as you need to know the terminologies of the functionality that you're installing as well, right? So this is where it comes into handy. You need to know what are the commands for installing, let's say, applications or the packages, right? So I'm first updating my apt-get, then I'm installing Nginx into it, right? -y is for S for installation. Then what I'm doing is I'm copying the local index.html into a working directory of Nginx, right? So that is the working directory of Nginx from where it basically looks for the files, the static files, right? So I've copied one file into it. Then entry point, as I show you, this is the command which will be run when your container is running or when your container is starting. So this is the command to run an Nginx. User sbin Nginx. When you install Nginx, it will go into this particular directory. Then I'm running it into a background mode, the daemon mode, daemon kind of a thing, background kind of a thing, right? and then not a daemon kind of. I'm basically not running in a daemon mode. I want to see its web page so that I can show you that Nginx is up, and I'm exposing it on port 80. That is something we saw. So when I build an image, so let's build an image for it. What we will do is, let's say docker build, and we'll tag it, let's say my Nginx, and version, let's say 1.1. okay, I already have a 1.0, so I'll create 1.1 now, and I'll build it. So this should be very quick because I've done the build again, so everything should be fetched from the cache. Now I will run it. So docker run, so let me clear it out. Now say docker run, then my Nginx 1.1, run it in a background mode basically. So this should do it. One extra thing that we need to do is we need to do a port mapping, as I told you earlier that okay, before that, right, once this runs it, how to access this particular Nginx, because this is running in a container. Okay, so if I just do simple localhost, I may not be able to read it. So what I need to do is I need to first see what is the IP address of my Docker container which has been running, a Docker machine which has been created for me, right? The command for that is docker machine IP, because I have my Windows machine on top of it. I'm running a Docker machine, which is a virtualization which has been given to me by Oracle VM, and this is IP which has been assigned to it. Okay, now let's run our. I need to use this particular IP address when I try to access Nginx. So let's say docker run my Nginx colon 1.1. This is my version. Let's say running in a background mode. It has to be here, right? Another thing that we need to do is a port mapping that I told you. So from our Docker file, we expose the port 80, but we need to map it with our container as well. So let's say default port is 80 on which Nginx is running, and we exposed it. And what I need to do is I want to run it into 80 port of my uh, my machine as well, right? So I'm using the machine's port 80, mapping it to a container port 80. Okay, so let me run it, and we'll access it and see whether it's working or not. Okay, the port is already allocated. Let me run it on, let's say 90. This should be running now, and we'll try to access it into our IP address which we just saw, which is 192.168.9900 and on port 90. So if you see, we got the welcome to Nginx. Now if you saw again the port allocated exception that we got on 80, also I'm running an Nginx, right? Although both the Nginx from the container perspective running on port 80 only, but I've mapped it. I'm running two different containers now. One is running on 8, both are running on 80 on a container side of it, but from the machine side of it, another port is mapped as 90, and first one is mapped as 80. So this is the beauty of Dockerizing, right, or running your containers basically. Although everything is running on 80, I'm really able to map it to two different ports on my machine, and I'm running two different instances of Nginx. So if I do docker ps, I should see two different processes which has been running it. Both are Nginx. So one is running on my Nginx, another is running on my Nginx 1.0. That is our current image that we just built. Okay, I think that should be okay. And these names are basically randomly allocated. Let's say if you want, I can run another one. Let's say on port 100, and I map a name to it. This is the best practice. You should try it. I say name is, let's say, Praveen. Now let's say after this I do a docker ps, I should see three different processes and one with the name Praveen onto it. Let me clear this out. If you see now, the name is coming as Praveen, the first one, right? So this is how you can do it. Um, so this is pretty much it from the Docker file perspective. What we saw is that the basic commands that has been involved in the Docker file, how to create your Docker file. We try to Dockerize the Nginx. We created a container out of it. The next thing that we saw is how to Dockerize the Java application, right? So we'll create a simple Spring Boot application and we'll see how to Dockerize it using the Docker file. Okay, so see you on the next lecture. Thank you so much for tuning in.